Oh, there is a lot to talk about in this one. It scored worse than the previous software version. There was a traffic violation, yet this model feels way more intelligent and aware of what's going around it than the previous models. So what gives? How does all of that coexist? Let's talk about it. If you're new here, welcome. I'm Mike, you're watching Thunderbolt Auto, and this is the Mountain Loop test. Rivian has set forth to do point-to-point self-driving by the end of this year. That's their goal, and they're aggressively going after it. So with every successive software release, I'm driving this consistent Mountain Loop to give a score to the system to see exactly how much it's advancing. And if they hit their goal, they'll have a perfect score by the end of the year. They're making progress, but boy do they have a long way to go. If getting into EV autonomy and tech is your thing, hit subscribe because that's my bread and butter. This one honestly broke my brain a little bit. Somehow simultaneously, this is the most advanced model that we've ever seen out of a Rivian software update, but somehow it scored worse on all of the testing that I did, but also it feels better in a lot of ways. It's a big conundrum. And I actually ended up changing the scoring system a little bit too, a lot of which was thanks to your feedback. You're more than welcome to use the chapter markers down below to skip to any of the segments you like. But first, I'm going to talk about the software update itself, what it includes, and my thoughts on it. I'm going to talk about the scoring system and how it's being modified a little bit. We're going to go through the road test, and then I'll talk about my analysis after the road test. So go ahead and skip to any part you'd like, or if you want to go, let's just dive into it. First, let's talk about what the release notes for this update even said. In case you're watching this in the future, this is the 2026.07 update from April of 2026, obviously. And there's only 2 line items for autonomy in this update. And they don't really say much. The 2 line items are, number 1, fixed an issue that caused the vehicle to immediately reject lane change on command after a previous lane change. And number 2, updated the in-vehicle messaging for unsuccessful universal hands-free engagement requests when turn signals are active or hands are off the steering wheel. And that's it. They didn't really say much else. But as Rivian has proven to do, even if the update notes say little to nothing about the autonomy update, they definitely do update the model that's running in the background. And boy, did they ever on this one. And it's really interesting because at first blush, the model doesn't feel incredibly different from what they had on the previous version. And you wouldn't be blamed for not even noticing the difference. However, there are differences, and they actually kind of got in the way of the scoring of this test, which is kind of interesting. And, well, like I said, we'll dive into that a little bit more. But the thing that I noticed about this model is there is a lot more happening under the hood. It feels to me like they've put just a little bit more of that large driving model that we experienced in December, the point-to-point full self-driving system. It seems like we have a little bit more of that DNA in this model. It seems to be doing a lot more reasoning and seeing a lot more nuance in situations. And I've got a list here that I wrote down of some of the things that I've noticed that this model is doing. One of the big ones that I noticed is it's starting to understand taking turns at intersections. And there's 2 times where I actually noticed this. One time when I was approaching a T, and there were a couple of vehicles in front of me at the stop sign at this T. And when I was next in line, the person right in front of me started to move. And when the person in front of me started to move, I actually could see the planned path trajectory that was taking a left turn at this intersection. I fully understood it was an intersection, and you need to make a turn there. So interesting to see that it was planning that. Obviously, it wouldn't actually be allowed to take that turn, and I had to disengage the system. But this actually did happen a second time as well, and I was able to watch it a little bit more closely because it was a more controlled environment. On this one, I was traveling straight down the road, and there was a right turn onto a side street. And this was sort of later at night. There weren't very many cars on the road, but I happened to have two cars right in front of me. And both of these two cars actually took that right turn. And what was interesting to me is normally on this stretch of road, I've noticed that my Rivian will just drive straight through and just continue straight as it's supposed to on that road, not taking any turns. However, it seemed to be a little bit influenced by the two vehicles in front of me, and it actually started to kind of move off to the side like they were moving off to the side to go around the corner. And likewise, when the two cars went around that corner, it actually slowed down and it tried to take the corner. However, there is an outside system that runs as a harness, if you will, for the AI system. And if the model ever tries to do something that's against the rules, it'll put a stop to it. It's sort of an extra safety feature so that if the model tries to do something that is either wrong or unsafe, it will prevent it from happening so that you are always in a safe situation. And in this case, the harness was actually set up to prevent it from trying to take turns at intersections. And so as soon as I could see that the model was contemplating and trying to make this turn, immediately it came up, with sounds and the message on the screen telling me to take over. So kind of interesting behavior there. And that seems to be the theme for this update in general. This model has a lot more capability and has a lot more reasoning. And it seems to butt heads with the safety layer with this harness a lot more frequently. And so it feels like this update's sort of like one step forward, two steps back because of that, because you have these two systems fighting each other where the safety layer has very strict rules that it wants to adhere to. And now that this model has a little bit more intelligence and understands a little bit better the road, it wants to do more than it's allowed to do, and it bumps up against this safety layer a little bit more frequently. And, obviously, I'm going off of just observation with all of this stuff. None of it has been explicitly confirmed by Rivian, so I may not have the finer details exactly right, but observationally, this is what it feels like happening. A couple of other improvements that I've noticed with this update. The perception in general seems to be a lot stronger, especially on the sides. Typically, the Rivian system has been a very front perception heavy system where, anything in front of it, it does pretty well with perception, but off to the sides is only okay. This seems to take a step in the right direction. There's still definitely a lot of improvement to be done with the side perception, but it does seem to be getting a lot wider depth of vehicles. It seems to be seeing vehicles from farther away. It's doing a lot better job of drawing lines on the road. Still not 100% accurate, but it's certainly a step in the right direction with that perception. It also seems to do a lot better with predicting other vehicles' behavior with cut-ins, for example. Or one huge area of improvement that I noticed is when you're driving on a city street and there's a vehicle that takes a left turn and cuts across the lane in front of you, even if that vehicle was quite far away, in previous versions, it would kind of cause universal hands-free to stab the brakes and kind of freak out a little bit about that. But it seems to have a better understanding now of vehicles that are, turning left and crossing the lane in front of you, or on the freeway, cutting in. Still some improvement to be done there, but it does seem to have a much more profound understanding of that. In fact, on my commute home from work today, I actually noticed some interesting behavior at a traffic light where I was a few cars back and the light turned green, but the vehicle directly in front of me had not yet started to move. But all of the vehicles around kind of started to inch forward because, people do that. Even if the car in front of you isn't starting to move, all of the, humans a lot of times will just kind of inch forward because they know that the light has turned green. And I observed that behavior on the commute home today, where the light turned green, the truck in front of me was staying still, but everybody around was kind of starting to inch forward, and so did my vehicle. And to be clear, I did not feel unsafe at all. It was just barely inching, and it honestly felt very human-like. People do that. People inch forward. And so there's a whole bunch of interesting, deeper reasoning and more human-like behaviors that we're seeing. So really cool stuff. But there are definitely some regressions that have come with this advancement. So the thing that I was mentioning before about it colliding with the harness. And I've also noticed that it seems to hug the left side of the lane situationally, which is very interesting. It doesn't always do it, but when it does, it seems to kind of hug towards the left. Um, it seems that the spicy mode following distance is a little bit less consistent. It follows pretty close sometimes, like it did before, and other times it would follow at more what I would call a medium distance or even a mild distance. So a few inconsistencies with that. The steering wheel also feels like it's a little bit less steady and a little bit more twitchy. It certainly didn't feel unstable at all, but just some refinement issues, if you will. So with all of that in mind, now let's talk about the actual road testing that I did. It's really interesting because with these advancements, it definitely did better in some areas, but as far as the scoring goes, it actually did measurably worse. And I did run the test 2 times because there were 2 releases of the software update. They started to roll out the update, and there were some issues with people losing their elevation statistics, their record high and record low elevation. And I heard anecdotally that there may have been some phone key issues as well for a few Gen 1 owners. So they stopped the rollout, and then a few days later, they had a patched version of the same software update. So I ran my Mountain Loop test both pre and post patch, and I don't think there was any change to autonomy. I did it just to be safe, but I'll include both of those road tests and the results in this video. So before we get into the actual road test, I heard you guys, and there are some changes that I made to the scoring system so that it makes a little bit more sense. So I tweaked a couple things with the scoring system, and I actually retroactively modified the score of the previous test that I did to match the new version of the scoring system so that we have something to compare it to. And really quick, I do want to just give a huge thanks to you all for being engaged with my content. I was able to take your feedback and incorporate it back into the testing procedures to make it just a little bit better. And I am very grateful that you're all willing to be engaged and learn with me in this process, because it definitely is an interesting learning process for Rivian as it is for me to watch it advance. So there's a couple of changes that I made. The first change I made to the scoring system is lane changes. Lane changes kind of can vary depending on road conditions, and this is a real world test, so results are going to vary from run to run, even on the same software. But to try and at least minimize those run to run changes, from now on, I'm only going to be including lane changes that are required in order to follow the route. Lane changes that I just sort of make as a discretionary thing, based on how traffic is flowing, things like that, that will be accounted for differently, and we will come back to that one in just a second. The other change that I made is to the disengagements category. I simplified the scoring a little bit. Previously, we had disengagements that were queued by the driver as 10 points and disengagements that were queued by the system when it just gives up and doesn't want to go anymore as 20 points. Now, both of those are just 10 points. And I also added a third 10-point violation, and this one is called traffic violations, when it breaks a rule of the road. And there is a very specific reason I did this. You'll see why. You need to watch the road test. So this is what I'm going to be calling now the incident report. This is sort of the concrete, did it or did it not perform the function? But one of the big pieces of feedback that I got from you all, and again, thank you again for that, is that it doesn't really take into account how it feels to use, how human-like it is. And so we needed to have a more subjective score as well. And so with that, I give you the vibe check. This is a rubric that focuses on sort of the feel of things. It's a little bit more subjective. It's just kind of more based on my feeling. It's not anywhere near as scientific as the incident report. But I'll be including both of these with my road tests so you can kind of get a feel for what it operationally does and does not do, and also what it feels like. The vibe check works in a very similar way to the incident report, where 0 is a perfect score and any amount of points above that is worse. So there's 5 different categories here based on feel. The first one is the brake check factor. This is basically just how it feels with acceleration and deceleration. Is it accelerating at the right places? Is it decelerating comfortably for turns? Things like that. Second one is the scooch factor. How well it stays centered in the lane, if it moves away from semis appropriately, hugging, things like that. Third is the unawareness factor. This is for situational awareness of things that are happening around it. For example, speed matching for lane changes. This is when someone cuts you off. Does it slam on the brakes? Things that have to do with interacting with other drivers on the road. The white knuckle factor. This is sort of an overall confidence and how confident you feel in the system and how predictable it is. If it's predictable and you know how it's going to act, then you're not worried about it. If you feel like you're having to eagle eye watch it all the time, that's not a good thing. So all of those categories I just mentioned are scored 0 to 5. 0 being it doesn't have that factor at all, no stress. 5 meaning that there's a lot to be concerned with it. And then the last category is the move it factor. This is where I'm going to put those discretionary lane changes that I mentioned earlier. You know, anytime I change a lane to go around traffic. And this is included here because at some point in the future, it should be doing these kinds of lane changes as well automatically. You know, if there's slow moving traffic, get into a new lane to go around it. But for now, since I'm the one that has to queue those need to count somewhere. So since this is more of a discretionary my choice sort of a thing, this is here. And unlike the other factors in the vibe check, this one does not have a limit of 5. It's just 1 point per however many lane changes I end up doing. I actually went back and redid the scoring for the previous test to match this new scoring metric. It scored 35 on the incident report, 14 on the vibe check, and it got a total score of 49. So without further ado, let's go through those 2 runs. Also, real quick, I just want to give a quick shout out to Vion for sending these sunshades over to me. They are making such a huge difference for filming. It does a great job of controlling light and heat in the cabin. So one, the camera gear doesn't overheat, I don't overheat, and it makes it a lot easier to film without having weird light coming across. As we're coming into summer, I highly recommend checking them out. They do really well with heat rejection, and they're built extremely well. If you're interested in looking at them, you can use my referral code TVOLTS to get 10% off, and the link is down below. Without further ado, let's get into that drive. So starting now, we're going to have a failure to disengage because nothing changed there. Yeah, it's not even making the nope sound. Just adaptive cruise control is unavailable right now. So we are not engaging on this road. Man, that Hummer is just huge. It's huge. Never bigger. I'm not good at that impersonation. I'm not Gajeebs. Oh, Ben. All right. First engagement. And we're going to have to immediately disengage to follow the route. We're just racking in those points. So, you know, I'm not entirely sure that there's going to be anything that's like different score-wise on this run, but it is definitely a different model that's, you know, a little bit more aggressive, and I like it. Okay. And we're engaged. And, oh, we're going to have to take the points for disengagement there because we are the lead vehicle at a red light. And this is where it's kind of interesting that it actually can vary slightly run to run just because of it's the real world and there's different real world conditions. And we are off. I'm going to go ahead and engage right now. So moving up here to freeway speed. Whoop. Okay, it did it good. I kept my hand on the wheel there because I wasn't sure what it was going to do, but I was not doing anything. A little call out that I want to make here. The meter to enter the freeway is not on at all times of day, and it was on for this particular test, but it wasn't on for the other testing that I've done. So in order to keep things equal, I'm just cutting that section out. Well, this apparently was the slow lane to choose. We're going to go ahead and get over here. There's a dense wall of traffic there, so let's see if it finds a way in. We're just waiting for this Tacoma to pass us. Now's our opportunity. Okay, yep, pretty good there. All right, our exit is coming up here in just a minute, so we may actually want to get into this lane over here. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the turn signal and see if it gets over. And nope, it botched that one. That guy was waiting for us, but it took too long. It needs to be quicker. We had a moment, and it should have taken it. All right, now we're taking this one because there's a lot bigger gap behind that truck. Looks like it is not going to do a lane change on this. Okay, well, I guess we're going to take the hit for a manual lane change there. That was weird. It like re-engaged after. Okay, I'm going to slow down here. So there's a manual speed change. I started to do the lane change, and before I had completed the manual lane change, it re-engaged in the original lane that I was in, and so it completely disengaged itself after. That was not great. That was worse than before. Okay, I just want to take a second to interject here and explain a little bit better what was going on with this situation. What was happening is, for some reason on this particular exit lane, lane change on demand is not available. This is almost certainly an HD mapping issue because Rivian is still relying on these maps to determine when lane changes are and are not allowed. And for whatever reason, this particular lane appears to not be mapped. And so you have to do a manual lane change in here. And this was actually true on the first test as well. I went back and reviewed the footage. In this case, there was something weird happening with it though, where when I tried to initiate a lane change, it didn't seem to recognize that I was trying to do a lane change, and it tried to hold on as if I was doing a co-steer move. It tried to hang on to universal hands-free. And so it tried to re-engage lane centering before I had even finished the lane change, and it re-engaged on the original lane. And then because I was halfway through moving when it decided to re-engage, it ended up counting as a disengagement. So not very graceful. Instead of letting me do a manual lane change, since lane change on demand was unavailable, it just tried to hold on. So in this case, it actually accrued 11 points for this because 1 was the manual lane change that started to happen, and then 10 points for the disengagement. And this actually happened on both the first and the second runs with both of these software revisions. Okay, I'm gonna have to take over here to get into this next lane over here. So disengagement to follow a route. And re-engaged. And we are not the lead vehicle at this stoplight, so we can at least take advantage of that. So that is nice. Okay, I'm gonna have to disengage here for following the route. That's a speed limit change, and we're gonna have to do a manual lane change here. So 2 of those things at the same time there. But yeah, so far we're cruising along, and on this stuff, I'm not actually sensing a huge difference. You know, it's doing pretty well on this mountain pass stuff. I'm very curious to see on, oh, we did not get that on the first one. Touch the steering wheel there, an audible warning to touch the steering wheel. Oof. You know, it's performing very similarly to the previous version, but in a few areas, it's actually doing worse. So I'm wondering if we're going to get a worse score on this model. And you know, when you're dealing with AI models, that is bound to happen. It's still wanting to have hands on the wheel for all of this. It still hasn't queued hands-free yet. This is interesting. Yeah, it did not do. Okay, now we're back to hands-free again. Okay, so we're coming up to the summit here. So I'm going to go ahead and, well, I'm going to need to disengage to turn left here, but I'll wait until we get up to the front of the line so that I can do the disengagement up there. Interesting how that happens. You know, it's never just a straight linear upward. It's always kind of a little bit of a, you know, up and down trending upward, but you know, there's always a little bit of an up and down. I do think that Rivian tries to play it pretty conservatively, and so they generally try to wait for a release until they're confident it's going to be better in every way, but it just doesn't always work out that way. Okay. Well, it said keep your hands on the wheel, but it did not take away the hands-free symbols. So I'm going to go ahead and count that as a point for an audible notification. It didn't follow through with the audible notification. It stayed hands-free the entire time, but it definitely did show it there. Okay, so we're coming down into that neighborhood just at the bottom of the hill here. It doesn't seem to have so much trouble with the turnoffs in this section because it's a relatively straight piece of road. But once we get up into the more curvy area up here, where we have the medians and everything, that's where it seemed to be getting a little bit more tripped up by the turnoffs. So hopefully this model does a little bit better job deciphering, because it definitely feels like it's, you know, gotten a lot smarter in that area. Yeah, it didn't seem to be phased by that one. And I'm noticing that the lines drawn on the display are a little bit more accurate as well. Yeah, not even phased by that turnoff. So, you know, I don't know if it's coming across on the camera, but the wheel movements feel just a titch more jittery here, just a little bit more jumpy than they did on previous versions, not quite as smooth. You can see it thinking in real time with the wheel. You can see it making decisions. But it is absolutely understanding a lot better what the intended path on this road is. So kind of cool to see all of that training data come into play here. Let's see if it, oh, nope, never mind. No saving grace there. It did much better on all of those turnoffs, except for that last one. Coming around that corner, it's a little bit harder for it. Ooh. All right, and I'm going to disengage here to follow the route. That said, right before I disengaged to follow the route, you may have noticed it thought about going into that out of their turn lane too. So definitely an improvement on the previous turn lanes, but it's not entirely solved. Okay, another audible warning for no reason there. It flashed up and disappeared even before I could read it on that one. We're just racking up points for fun at this point, where it does not need to rack up points. So, and another one there for no reason. So we're gonna go ahead and disengage to make our turn here. Re-engage on this, and we're going to have to disengage immediately again up at this light because we're going to have to make a turn. Okay, disengage to follow the route. Okay. Oh, it actually did flash up the hands for a split second there. I wasn't able to engage. I did try, but there was a split second when it did show the hands-free symbol. So maybe soon on some coming update, we're going to be able to get it to engage on this little road here right in front of the grocery store. And adaptive cruise is unavailable, so no behavior change on this road. I think it'll be a bit before we get an engagement on this road, just because there's no lines on it. And, you know, even though this is technically 2 segments of road because of the roundabout in the middle, we'll just count it as one. You know, I'll try to engage there. Still no adaptive cruise control. And again, this is a single road by the test. But we'll turn left at this light, and then it will be our first road that we can actually engage on. All right, so we've got our first engagement here. And, you know, as always in the previous tests, immediate disengagement because we need to follow the route and turn right here. Okay, so we're going to engage again on this section of road here. And it looks like there's going to be a red light up ahead, but we have this box truck in front of us, so we can just leave the system engaged for the red light, which is a good win for this one. This truck is taking the curve nice and slow here, and we're just following suit. And this is the obnoxious merging here, where we're just going to have to hope that this all works out well, because the vehicle does not yet know how to merge. And yep, I'm not going to have to intervene here because it's going to merge and it'll realize. So, you know, it's getting to the point where it understands merges. Oh, there's an audible warning. So kind of the same kind of behavior that we saw in the last one. A little bit different context. Didn't happen there last time. It seems to me that even though it didn't trigger in that exact spot last time, the pattern that I'm starting to see here from yesterday and today is that a lot of these warnings are actually happening during merges. Whenever there's like right at the last second when a merge is just ending, it seems a warning pops up. And I'm not sure if it's because the AI model has some threshold that it's hitting of like lack of confidence for just a split second. Not entirely sure what's triggering that, but it does seem to be related to merges somehow. Yep, and just like yesterday, this is gonna have to be a manual lane change. That was interesting. I had an issue yesterday where it wasn't doing the lane change, and it like tried to re-engage before I had finished the manual lane change. I'm gonna score this one the same because I behaved differently. The system did not behave differently, but I behaved differently. Disengagement there to follow the route. But yesterday, it tried to get off or tried to re-engage while I was still in that same lane before I'd finished the lane change. This one, it tried to do the same thing, but I pulled on the wheel a little bit harder to force it into the new lane before it tried to do that same thing. So I'm gonna go ahead and score it the same way that it played out yesterday, just because I was the difference in behavior there, not the system. Okay, and we're re-engaging on this road here. Oh, that was an unprompted lane change. No turn signal, it just changed lanes there. Okay, so let's talk about what just happened here. Normally, UHF has been pretty darn good at understanding how to cross an intersection. When you're going from one side to the other, it usually has a very sound understanding of what lane on the other side of the intersection corresponds to the lane that you're in currently. And this is honestly the one and only time I have ever experienced this with universal hands-free. But it appears what happened is it got confused which lane on the other side of the intersection corresponded with my lane. And so it ended up in the middle of the intersection crossing over to that other lane. It didn't mean to change lanes, but that was the end result of what happened. So it was actually very bad behavior in that regard. You know, fortunately, it wasn't that big of a deal. There were no other cars around me, so it ended up being fine. But that's not something that we want to reward. And, you know, like I said, this is the only time I've ever experienced that. So more than likely a fluke. And this is probably just one of those growing pains of a more advanced model, because it's thinking and reasoning a little bit more, sometimes well, sometimes not. And we're going to disengage so that we can follow the route. And we're engaging. Okay, manual speed adjustment here for a speed limit adjustment. And we're doing a manual lane change because this lane is ending. We just barely missed that red light, but in any case, we have this car in front of us, so we wouldn't have had to disengage for that. Okay. Yeah, it's cute letting us stay hands-free at this point. And just like yesterday, we had lane changed into this lane. And, oh, okay. Hands on the wheel. Okay, so it did prompt it. Okay. Yeah, so this is definitely a consistent regression from the last one. And to be fair, I didn't expect there to be hugely different behavior with the patch just because the patch wasn't for autonomy stuff. But yeah, and it still wants hands on the wheel. It's a significant amount of time, and it's so interesting to me because like these curves that we're going around are not the most aggressive curves, nor are we going particularly fast around them. It's just for whatever reason, this particular curve is triggering it now. On the downhill side, there's some that are pretty similar to this, and it's just flying through them. Okay, we're back to hands-free again. We're turning left here, so disengagement to follow the route. There's a couple cars in front of us, so I probably could have left it engaged a little bit longer, but it won't make a difference to scoring. And re-engaging again. I would say that almost every time, if not every time, okay, again in that same spot, keep your hands on the wheel warning, but it did not actually go into hands-on mode. So same exact behavior. That almost feels to me like a mapping thing because it is so consistent in the exact same spot. Possibly a mapping thing. I'm honestly not sure. But anyway, it seems to me that when it does go into hands-on mode, but it's still engaged, it's almost always, if not always, felt unnecessary to me. It does perfectly fine staying in the lane at the speed that it's at. The hands on the wheel thing just seems overly cautious to me. Like, it does fine. It seemed to do better last time with these turnoffs, but not entirely solved. The last one in particular is what tripped it up. So we'll see if that's the same, just based on how similar everything else has been on this run. I'm going to assume that it's going to behave just like it did yesterday. Okay, and this is the one that tripped it up yesterday. And, yep. It didn't trip up as badly this time as it did last time. But it definitely did need some intervention there. It didn't like full on take that turn, but it definitely got a little close for comfort. So disengagement to follow the route here. Oh, we're gonna have to do a merge here, so it'll be interesting to see. I think we'll be okay. I think this Jeep is gonna pull ahead enough that the merge will be a non-issue. It'll, kind of get on the brakes here. Oh, okay, so there's an audible warning, and it did get on the brakes, but not in an incredibly aggressive, uncomfortable way. So that's good. Okay, and we're going to go for a disengagement to follow the route. Engage here. And then we're going to have another immediate disengagement to follow the route at this light. And, yep, no engagement there. Yesterday, when I was coming through this section, it did just for a brief second flash up the universal hands-free available sign. It did not actually let me engage, but it did flash up for a second. This time I didn't even see it flash up at all. And there you have it. There were the road tests. Certainly not a clear step forward as far as the scoring goes. However, I do think that this was a necessary step in the progression of making a smarter AI driving model. So let's talk about the scores and why I think that. So looking across the scores between last time and the 2 runs for this software release, there's actually not a lot of changes in most of the categories. It's pretty comparable in most areas. But there were a couple of things that just were the Achilles heel that really drove up the score. One of them was the audible nags. And what I found interesting about this is a good number of those audible nags happened on curves where that did not happen in the previous release. What the previous release did was it slowed down for those curves in what I felt was a slightly unnatural way. It wasn't enough to prompt me to nudge the system to make it go faster, but it did feel a little unnatural how it slowed down. In this software release, it did not slow down. It took what I would consider to be a more natural speed. However, it prompted for hands-on. I suspect that this may have actually been something that was by the control system or the harness outside of the AI, that it hit some kind of threshold for G-force or something like that prompts for hands on the wheel. It didn't feel incapable, but it just, sent out that ding. So that was one of the big ones. There were also some audible nags on the merges, like right when a merge was just about to come together, it a couple of times again prompted that hands-on nag. And, in almost all of these hands-on nag cases, it didn't actually want me to put the hands on the wheel. It didn't actually switch to hands-on mode. It just like momentarily had a little blip that triggered the sound, but then went back to hands-free immediately anyway. So some interesting behavior that seems to be sort of a fight between the AI model and the control layer. And then, of course, I have to mention the interventions. And this was another just very small thing that ended up being the demise of this model, where it required the intervention to get off of that lane change, getting off the freeway. And also that one weird one where it like accidentally went to the wrong lane on the other side of the intersection. Again, none of these are huge deals, but they were interventions, and so that's where it came from. So I can see how the model is definitely smarter, and it's necessary to have the smarter model so Rivian can collect data from the real world and make it a little bit better. But unfortunately, that means that the system is calling for attention a little bit more regularly. So now let's talk about the vibe check. Again, the vibe check was very similar between all three of these tests, but the breakdown of it was a little bit different. The big difference was the brake check factor. The brake check factor, again, is the acceleration and deceleration. It felt a lot more natural in this one just because it wasn't slowing down around those curves. So it actually got a lower, better score on this model than it did the previous model. This model also got a little bit better with the unawareness factor, interacting with vehicles around it. And this is primarily due to what I was talking about with vehicles crossing in front of you in cities or cut-ins, things like that. Still definitely some improvement that needs to be done, especially with the cut-ins, but it is better than what it was before, so we got knocked down a point on that one. Where it did worse on the vibe check, though, was the scooch factor, because it will occasionally hug the left side of the lane in this model. And on that last run in particular, it got an extra point on the white knuckle factor as well because of that random lane change that it shouldn't have done. So let's talk about the final scores here. You're welcome to pause and look at these breakdowns a little bit more if you'd like to. So the previous software version got 35 on the incident report. The first run on this software got 47 on the incident report. And the second release of this software, the patch, got 50 on the incident report. On the vibe checks, the previous software version got 14 on the vibe check. The first release of this software version got 14 on the vibe check as well. The breakdown is different, but the same score. And the second run got 15 on the vibe check. And again, this was because of that lane change incident. And the final scores are 49 for the previous software release, 61 for this software release, first version, and 65 for the second release of this software version. So there you have it. There was the Mountain Loop test for the April 2026 update. There's definitely a lot of work to be done. It was a regression in a lot of ways, but just because it was a regression with the score doesn't mean that it's not headed in the right direction. This extra intelligence definitely does give me some hope that we could see some cool things, hopefully very soon with the model. But until the next one, thanks for joining. If you're buying a Rivian, use my referral code down below. It'll give you up to 500 points to the gear shop, plus you get free charging. Good perks. And you will meet good. First on the things that come to things. So the vibe check and